Israel appears to be planning a major operation into Rafah, the southern portion of the Gaza Strip, where as many as 1.5 million Palestinians are currently seeking refuge. If so, this could lead to a very significant spike in civilian casualties. U.S. officials say that Israel is nowhere near eliminating Hamas. New poll data shows how American perceptions of this war have changed between October and January, and the Houthis petitioned some of their neighbors to allow their soldiers to march through and join the fight in Israel. We got a lot to get into, so I'm glad you're here. I'm recording this at 9 a.m. Central on Friday, February 9th, 2024. Yesterday, Israel put out news that during a raid in Gaza, they said their forces uncovered a rocket launcher placed by Hamas near a kindergarten and a mosque. We've got a video here that we can show. They say additionally, during searches of the civilian water facility in the area, the forces found a tunnel shaft leading to an underground tunnel route inside the facility. Entering that tunnel, or upon entering that tunnel, the IDF eliminated 2 Hamas militants. The news coming out of Netanyahu's office said that, quote, "It is impossible to achieve the war goal of eliminating Hamas and leaving 4 Hamas battalions in Rafah." So essentially, they cannot eliminate the entirety of Hamas if they let these 4 organizations that are currently in Rafah, according to Israel, continue to exist. They say, on the other hand, it is clear that a massive operation in Rafah requires the evacuation of the civilian population from the combat zones. This is incredibly tricky. It sounds like as many as 1.5 million Palestinians are now kind of crammed in down along the southern border with Egypt in the Rafah area. We'll pull up some maps here so you can see what that looks like. The National Security Council spokesperson, John Kirby, spoke to this yesterday, saying that an Israeli ground offensive in Rafah is, quote, "not something we would support." And one of the major reasons for this likely is just how dense, if you thought northern Gaza or even Khan Yunis was densely populated, wait until you see what military operations look like in Rafah. There's just been nowhere else for the Palestinian people to go, right? They've been slowly pushed out from the north to the south. And then as those operations move through Khan Yunis and the central and southern Gaza, they've been pushed further and further south. They have nowhere else to go. And they're not being permitted to move north because there are still combat operations ongoing. It's, again, if we'll see how Israel adjusts tactics should they move into Rafah. But if they, just looking at how operations went in the north, central, and even portions of Khan Yunis, those same tactics carried out in Rafah would lead, I'm pretty confident in saying, to a significant spike in civilian casualties, just given the density of civilians in that area. So something to keep an eye on here in the next couple of days. It looks like we've started to see more airstrikes and long-range precision strikes carried out in Rafah over the past couple of days. It looks like this is something that could kick off before too long. And it makes sense from the Israeli perspective, if you think about it. If they're trying to eliminate all of Hamas across Gaza, they can't move through 70% of the territory or even 90% of the territory. They have to move through the entirety and do everything they can to eliminate every single Hamas militant that they come across. Now, according to U.S. intelligence officials, in a report that just came out yesterday, they supposedly told members of Congress that Israel had degraded Hamas's fighting capabilities, but was not close to eliminating the group. This is a leak. This is a leak from an intelligence briefing to Congress that made its way out to the public through the New York Times. So there's portions of this that we don't have access to, but for the most part, anytime something like this comes out publicly, there's a reason for it. It sometimes can be hard to understand exactly the reason for it, but this might be, who knows, signifying some pressure to push Israel towards negotiated settlement, something like that. Either way, notable that this is a leak. They say American intelligence officials have refrained from offering specific estimates of how many Hamas fighters have been killed, arguing that such estimates are neither accurate nor meaningful. I'm glad they put that in here because for any conflict, this one included, there's always so much debate around how many militants have been killed and exactly how many Hamas fighters, because we are seeing the Israeli figures thrown out day in and day out. And I'm glad they just tossed it out there and said it doesn't really matter overall. That's not actually a valuable measure of success. They said American officials say perhaps only a third of Hamas fighters have been killed. Before the war, estimates of Hamas fighting strength ranged from 20,000 to 25,000. So 1/3 of that is roughly 6,000 to 8,000 in total. 6,000 to 8,000 total Hamas militants killed by Israel since October 7th. But this part, again, I'm glad they're putting this in here. It shows, like, we got this stuff wrong. We regularly get this stuff wrong in conflicts the United States fights. So I like that they're putting it in place here, recognizing this flaw in our in how we've operated in the past. They say, but American officials also emphasize that the United States has learned in war after war that counting the number of enemies killed in an insurgency or counterterrorism operation is a fool's game. They say operations that kill militants often radicalize others, swelling the ranks of enemy organizations. And U.S. officials say death counts of fighters do not give an indication of whether a government has addressed the core issues driving the war. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here, because you have to, if Israel is trying to eliminate Hamas as a military threat to Israel, there is an aspect of having to kill those militants and having to degrade their military capability. A lot of that is the elimination, especially of senior leaders, but even of the lower-level militants across the organization. However, that's not the only thing, and there's not a tipping point necessarily that we've been able to find in the past where 51% of a terrorist organization eliminated means that they're going to collapse, or 78%, or 92%. It's very hard to figure out what that number is. And even if you get to the 100%, as they call out here, sometimes those actions radicalize others. So even if Israel is able to kill every single person who said that they were a member of Hamas and associated with Hamas on October 6th, let's say, before that attack was carried out, how many more people are willing and interested in joining those ranks or joining a movement to fight back against Israel now? Who knows, right? Is it a fraction? Is it double? Is it triple? So again, according to the United States, there's quite a few Hamas militants remaining yet to be killed by Israeli forces. However, that number doesn't indicate whether or not the core issues of what Israel is looking for here, the security of Israel going forward, has really been addressed. Then there was some poll data that came out this week that I thought was worth getting into, because they asked some of the same questions in this poll that were asked in a poll back in October, right after the October 7th attacks took place in Israel, so we can compare how American sentiment has changed over the course of the last couple months. What we see in this comparison is that favorable views of Israel dropped from 58% to 49%, and unfavorable views of Israel increased from 19% to 28%. Kind of in line there. They match, right? For Hamas, and they asked specifically here, Hamas, not Palestinians. They said for Hamas, their favorability went up from 6% to 8%, and their unfavorable views decreased from 71% to 68%. Now, both of those changes are right at about the margin of error for each of these polls, which was listed at 2.7%. I'm not an official pollster professional by a long shot, barely got through statistics in college. I think you can take that to mean that there's no meaningful change on the Hamas side, but the change in Israeli numbers is outside of that margin of error. Now, the same general trend applied to another question that was asked, asking, where do your sympathies lie more with? Who do your sympathies lie more with? Israel dropped from 43% in October to 33% in January, so a 10% decrease in who Americans' sympathies lie more with. Then Palestinians increased from 9% in October to 14% in January. So that first question was asking about Hamas. This question asking about Palestinians. Both of those changes are outside of the margin of error. And then two questions that were not asked back in October, but I thought were worth bringing up here. 45% of Americans said they would prefer that the U.S. work towards a ceasefire, with 31% saying they would prefer to support Israel as it tries to defeat Hamas. That feels about right. Most polls I've seen where it's just simply, do you support a ceasefire, yes or no? It's over 50% that said yes to ceasefire. So it makes sense that when you throw in another aspect of this, do you support a ceasefire, or would you prefer to support Israel as it tries to defeat Hamas? It makes sense that some of that is siphoned off to the second portion there, and then the 45% ends up being the one saying yes, ceasefire. But again, when it's just kind of the real clear-cut yes or no to ceasefire, the number that I consistently see is between 50 and I think 65%. They said then 23% said they would prefer a permanent ceasefire that ends the fighting but leaves Hamas in control of Gaza, while 38% said that they would prefer a continuation of the fighting until Hamas is no longer in control of Gaza. Now, I think it's important to bring these polls and these surveys up. Just these are very complicated issues in so many different ways, and I'm glad that they ask these questions in a bunch of different formats to kind of get at the nuance of these subjects. Right, again, I mentioned earlier, I've seen a lot of polls where it's ceasefire, yes or no. And I think that provides a little bit of insight, but there's so much more to this. I like that this one, they're breaking out sympathies between Palestinians and Israelis, favorability of Hamas versus Israel. It gets at more of the nuanced questions that I think are important here to understand. So again, when you're looking at the broader question, the big picture question of who do Americans support in this war, maybe is one of the bigger ones, or do the Americans support a ceasefire? I think it's still not as black and white as some polls make it seem. My big takeaway from this one is that the dynamics are changing a little bit. The Palestinians are starting to see more support from the American public. Israeli support is starting to fall off a bit. However, even with that change, you're still seeing, more than double of the American respondents here saying their sympathy lies more with Israel than they do the Palestinians. So again, hopefully they continue asking these same questions. We can come back to it in a few more months or as long as this conflict goes, so we can see how these perceptions change over time. Now, I also think it's interesting with these polls, these are American polls asking what we think of is happening in another country where they're making the decision. So there's always a part of me wondering, how important is that? I've said before, I think that sometimes our role, the United States' role in global affairs, is both overplayed and underplayed. We can't dictate everything that happens around the world, but we also do have some influence. So it's not necessarily black and white in every case, but I thought it was interesting that a lot of the focus, and it makes sense, I'm an American, consuming a lot of American news, and looking at a lot of these American polls, but when we look at what's happening in Israel, sometimes it's a little bit different. And I think that's probably more important here. They're the ones who are eventually going to be making this decision. And there was an article that came out yesterday. My buddy over at History Revealed on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram shared this with me because I did not come across it. But it was talking about how there's this large Israeli protest in favor of continuing the war, which I feel like is something we don't hear a lot. So they said that thousands of Israelis, including soldiers, parents of fallen soldiers, and relatives of Hamas hostages, took part in a rally called Victory March, Keep Going Until IDF Victory. And they quoted a couple people here. One of the organizers said, quote, "Our initiative is not connected to any political ideology. That is the reason why it gathered consensus within the Israeli public. Anything other than ending the war in unequivocal victory will make it extremely problematic for Israelis to continue living here." And someone else said, quote, "Why would you send my son to a war?" And I believe this person, they lost their son in this war. Said, quote, "Why would you send my son to war if you were not planning on finishing it? A few years from now, more people will die in terror attacks and more soldiers will fall in battle. There is no alternative to defeating our enemy, whose only reason for existing is to kill Jews." So again, we also see protests in Israel right now. I haven't really seen any protests in Israel for a ceasefire. I've seen protests in Israel, or reporting of protests in Israel, I should say, pressing Netanyahu to do more to bring the hostages home. But I just thought it was worth bringing up that there are also protests with thousands of people saying, continue this war, finish this once and for all. Then turning down to the Houthis in Yemen, where they just asked their neighbors to allow their soldiers to move on through so they could pick up the fight in Israel and Gaza. We'll see if that's unlikely, but a notable ask by the Houthis. So al-Houthi, incredibly long-winded. This guy's given long speech after long speech. They put out some pictures of some major rallies happening in Sana'a over the last 24, 48 hours. And in his statement, he said, quote, "We renew the ongoing demand to open safe land corridors for the Yemeni people and the free people of our nation to reach Palestine to participate directly in the battle with the enemy." That's the first. He says that this has been a repeated request. Maybe I've missed that in the past. But either way, that's the Houthis saying, we want to go up and fight Israel directly. Will you let us through? Now, the reason they have to make that ask is, if you look at, we'll pull up a map here, for the Houthis to get to Israel, they have to cross Saudi Arabia, which is probably a non-starter at baseline. I mean, they've been fighting a civil war for 10 years, and the other side of that war is funded by the Saudis. The Saudis have been killing a lot of Houthis over the past decade, not on friendly terms, exactly. Even as some of these negotiations have come about, it's hard to imagine that Saudi Arabia would say, yeah, Houthis, no problem. Throw some caravans of your fighters that we've been trying to kill for 10 years in Yemen and just drive straight across our territory. No issue there. So either way, that seems like a non-starter. But even if they do make it through there, it's possible, I would say, they've got enough connections through this Islamic resistance in Iraq, as well as some of the groups in Syria and then Hezbollah in Lebanon. and their Iranian overall connection, that I think it's possible that if they made it through Saudi Arabia, they possibly could get funneled, smuggled, if you will, through portions of Western Iraq into Syria, maybe even into Lebanon, to where they could participate in direct combat with Israel. It's a long shot. But anyways, notable that the Houthis are saying, we want to get up there. We want to engage directly with Israeli forces. Of course, until that time, it looks like what they're going to continue to do is just fire missiles, drones, and unmanned surface vessels at ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. That continued yesterday with U.S. Central Command putting out a statement saying that they conducted 7 self-defense strikes yesterday, February 8th, against 4 Houthi unmanned surface vessels and 7 mobile anti-ship cruise missiles that were prepared to launch against ships in the Red Sea. So good news, those didn't get launched. But notable, again, that we're seeing more and more of these unmanned surface vessels come out. I mentioned it a couple days ago. I don't know exactly what to read into that, but they're becoming more and more prominent. They're both getting destroyed in these U.S. preemptive strikes, as well as being intercepted in the water. A lot more of those in the last 5 to 7 days than we've seen so far in this conflict. But that's all I've got for now. Of course, if you're interested in these or other national security subjects, be sure to check out my Substack. Link is in the description below. We just put out an article today talking about how Ukrainian Special Forces soldiers are hunting Wagner fighters in Sudan amidst the ongoing civil war there. It's wild, but when you kind of dive into the reasons behind that, it kind of makes sense for both sides. Just an expansion of that war in a way that not a lot of people saw. Of course, it's free. Link in the description if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.